everyone, welcome to another academic video. This week it's all about talking to a large audience. Hey, if you're new, welcome to our little academic corner here on YouTube. My name is Caroline. I'm a UK-based senior lecturer in physics. So I research and I teach and I work in physics at a UK university. And I thought this week we could talk about when you have to give an event lecture or some kind of event talk to a large audience. Now, typically, within a university classroom setting, you might find yourself lecturing, say, 20 to 30 students. You could lecture crowds of 100, maybe in excess of 200, 300, depending on the subject that you teach and the university that you're working at. But when I do public events, I can be talking to much larger audiences. So last week I gave a talk to over 500 people, and that's quite typical when you're going out to these larger scale events. And it got me thinking, do I do things differently when I'm talking to a larger audience than when I'm addressing maybe a smaller number of people within an academic setting? So here are just really, my thoughts about it. So when you've got a larger audience, I think one of the things that I'm immediately conscious of is making sure that I try to bring all those audience members into the talk with me. When you have got a large room or a large auditorium of people in front of you, it can be quite tempting to talk to the same area of the room. And so I consciously make an effort to try to make sure I'm addressing the different parts of the audience. And again, it's quite easy, I think, to look at the kind of the direction, kind of like middling at your eye level. So you kind of look forwards at that audience and forget the people kind of nearer into you at the front and the people maybe who are higher up at the back of the kind of the auditorium or your lecture hall. And so I don't try to make it like some kind of like sweeping operation where I'm like always scanning and checking the room. But I do make sure that I'm not exclusively facing always to the right, always to the left. And I also think about where I'm standing in relation to any slides or visuals that are behind me. So quite often you'll have some kind of PowerPoint or some kind of slides. And in one of the talks I did the other week, it was great because that slide projector was right above my head. So I could stand almost in front of it and I wouldn't be blocking any of that content behind me because the screen started higher than my head. But another talk I gave the other week had actually a very, very thin stage, which was quite perilous. You're going to fall off it whilst giving your talk. So in that case, I had a remote clicker with me, and actually I stood on the ground level. So rather than actually being on the stage itself, I stood on the ground to deliver the content of the talk. And that had the advantage then that the slides were higher up behind my head. And so I guess one or two things I think about is, am I blocking any part of the visual? And if I am I moving enough to make sure I'm not annoying one section of the audience by always getting in their way? And secondly, I always carry one of those kind of slide clickers on with me. Always have one. Some venues will give you one and say, hey, we've got a slide clicker, fab. But the ability to advance your slides when you're nowhere near them is really useful. And I think especially when you're dealing in these kind of larger auditorium environments, being able to move away from the lectern and where the laptop is and still be able to progress through your talk remotely, so many times it's helped me out. So I always make sure that I have a slide advancer kind of remote clicker with me in my bag just in case. And spare batteries. The number of times you need spare batteries for these events. So clicker and batteries. Another thing I think about is when I'm delivering a talk or an event to a much larger audience, like a festival audience, one of these kind of large outreach activities, again, it's not having visuals behind me that have got too much content on. When you're in the classroom and you're lecturing a small number of students, they might be sitting typically closer to you, which means it's easier for them to read like font and things on your slides, although I do try to avoid using tiny font anyway. But when I'm doing an event with a really kind of large audience, I'm much more about using big pictures, maybe 1 or 2 points on the slides. It's much more about like the graphics of how that slide set looks, because you've got to imagine it not from the person just in the front row, but from the person who's way back way in the auditorium and is trying to enjoy and engage with your talk. So yeah, I always make my visuals quite bold. I make my colour choice quite bold. I try to make sure that I'm using very clear fonts, so nothing too swirly or kind of italic-y, and using really clear colours. So, I don't want to have white text on yellow because you just can't see it. So especially when I've got a larger audience, and that means audience members might be further away from me and the content I'm showing, it's trying to make sure that I've got punchy, bold visuals that will therefore appeal to the whole room. And projection of your voice and using a microphone again becomes really quite essential when you're doing these larger venues. In a lecture theatre, quite often I won't need to use a mic. I mean, I'll have one because we use it for our recording software to record the lectures. But in terms of voice projection in these kind of smaller classroom environments, quite often I don't need to have a microphone. But when I'm facing these larger spaces to give the talks, then a microphone, is pretty essential. And again, different venues will have different setups. So in some places you get like a lapel mic, sometimes you get a mic that goes over your ears and round on the side. If you get one of those mics, make sure that you've got your clothing as you want it, because quite often you set it up and then if you adjust your clothing, you can end up pulling that mic off your face. So I always try to make sure that is like my clothing is sorted before I put that mic on. And I think the hardest mics to work with, and I had one of these the other week too, is the handheld mic, because it blocks you from being able to use your hands a little bit to kind of like articulate a point or to show something or to be able to have the slide clicker to advance things. And when you've got a handheld mic, you have to be really conscious about where you're holding it. Most mics are kind of directional and there's like a sweet spot that you need to keep that mic in front of your face. And it's so tempting when you're talking to turn away and to not move the mic. And therefore your audience will just lose what you're saying. So it's remembering to move as one and keeping that mic a nice kind of, about a hand distance from your face, typically, so that you don't get too much kind of like reverberations or loud sounds when you're using it. But I definitely think using handheld mics can be trickier and take a bit of getting used to, a bit of practice. But if you're dealing with these larger audiences, being able to amplify your voice is essential. You can't shout in some of these venues and nobody really wants to listen to a shouting academic. So yeah, using mics effectively, I think, becomes more important if you have a super large audience and a large space. I think there's quite a lot of similarities though as well. Like, when you're giving a talk, regardless of the audience size, I try to make sure my talk runs to time, especially if I'm on an agenda with other people. I don't want to go over my time allocation because I think, other people have planned the event around certain timings. So I try to stick to whatever I've been allocated to talk to. And again, the level, so you might be talking to an audience of people who are very familiar with your area, your subject. Maybe you're giving more of a public lecture that's maybe people who aren't so familiar with your subject but are interested. And it's knowing that audience and helping you to tailor your talk that I think can help you become, or be an engaging speaker. And really, whether I'm talking to 20 people or to 500, 600 people, I still need to make sure I understand who's in the audience and who I'm talking to. It is slightly challenging to be interactive when you have these much larger audiences. When I've got a smaller crowd, I can maybe have people come up and be involved in what I'm doing. It's easier to maybe have questions coming from the audience. When it's a much larger crowd, I tend to find that we use kind of electronic tools to help us. So we might do like electronic surveys where the results appear on the screens behind us. At these larger scale events, sometimes there's talk moderators. So I'll be giving a talk And then as the audience are asking questions into like an electronic form, there's a moderator who then takes those questions and gives them to me at the end of the session to then answer some of those live to the audience. So rather than me taking questions directly from the audience, I'm taking questions via a kind of a moderator. So that can work quite well. So yeah, so when you have these larger crowds, it can change the dynamic of that Q&A session. But that was just my thoughts. So let me know, do you give talks to very large audiences? Are all your talks to very small audiences? Do you prefer talking to large venues or small venues? I kind of really enjoy them both. I think it's nice. Maybe you don't like giving talks at all, and actually it doesn't matter how many people in the audience, it's just not your thing. And we could definitely do a future video on that, about how to kind of get your confidence up so you can start to feel, if not at home, a little bit comfortable giving one of these talks to one of these audiences. But yeah, let me know in the audience, what are your top tips for talking to large or to small audience crowds? But in the meantime, I hope you have a really good week. I'm off to another week of lecturing and grant writing and PhD meetings and trying to book in some kind of winter fun activities, but time in this semester seems to be racing away as usual. But have a really good week, stay safe, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next Monday for a video. Oh, and if you're new, do hit subscribe and join our academic space here on YouTube. Right, until next Monday, bye.